I'm Brittany Harden-Tengway, a senior manager with KPMG, and I am fascinated by the practice of transfer pricing and its impact on the global market. Join me each episode as I explore the transfer pricing world with specialists who will explain the ins and outs of this niche practice where tax meets economics. Hello and welcome to another episode of KPMG's Exploring Transfer Pricing. Today we are going to demystify DEMPE, which stands for Development, Enhancement, Maintenance, Protection, and Exploitation. In June of 2024, at the KPMG Tax Cross-Border Conference, we had a panel looking into navigating some of the nuances that are associated with this concept as it relates to intangibles. I'm very fortunate to have our panelists here today who are also two of Washington National Tax's powerhouse PhD principal economists who have been at the leading edge of our KPMG practice for decades. Jack O'Meara, who's based out of Hartford, Connecticut. Welcome, Jack.
Hi, Brittany. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. And Preeta Subramanian, based out of our Boston office.
Hi, Brittany. Excited to be on.
I'm so happy you all are here. Jack, give us an overview of DEMPE and why it's important.
The concept of DEMPE goes back to the original BEPS project. In actions 8 through 10, those BEPS actions were published, and they subsequently got incorporated into the OECD's transfer pricing guidelines in 2017. What the DEMPE acronym stands for are functions related to intangible property. It also includes an updated view on the management and control of risk. And together, those two elements were intended to push back on some of the common international tax planning models that were prevalent at the time, which featured having a multinational's intellectual property located in an offshore tax-favored jurisdiction, very frequently performing no functions and simply funding the development of IP and therefore earning the associated IP profits. What the DEMPE framework said is if you want to have IP profits, you have to have some of the functions that are associated with the development and control of that IP.
Naturally, you would think different jurisdictions are going to feel differently about some of these concepts. Preeta, do you have any initial thoughts on that?
The DEMPE guidance was issued almost a decade back. I think of it like this toy that my son and his friends played with when they were younger, this flexible type of putty. The putty had a fixed mass, but then you could take it out of the container, roll it into a ball, throw it around, or stretch it into different shapes. With the DEMPE guidance, we've got this core mass of guidance, but it has taken different forms in the hands of different tax authorities and taxpayers. For example, the Chinese tax authority has noted the importance of DEMPE, but also promotion in the pricing of intragroup transactions. The Dutch tax authority, as another example, has emphasized the importance of the D, the development, and E, enhancement functions. What we have is this guidance taking different forms, which has led to it continuing to be such a hot topic of discussion and leading to a lot of challenges and controversy.
I completely agree with you, Preeta. There's a gray area inside of the DEMPE context, and that's because the way that the guidance was written, it provides a framework, and the framework has core principles, but because it's not fully developed, there's lots of room for interpretation. A question that we get all the time is, do I have sufficient DEMPE? And the answer is it's very hard to say because it exists on a sliding scale and there is no hard and fast rule for what constitutes sufficient DEMPE to support a particular transfer pricing model.
DEMPE looks different based on your facts and circumstances. Can we talk a little bit about the presentation you all did and some of the polling that we did as well?
What we find frequently is that many of our clients are very interested in DEMPE and have deep concerns about their DEMPE structures. What we hear from our clients all the time is, how do I compare to my peer group? We took an anonymous survey. It did enable us to get some really interesting feedback on different elements of DEMPE, what the experiences were of the clients that were in the room, and how they're addressing those DEMPE concerns that they do have.
There's a lot of curiosity. That's why we make these podcasts. It's a safe space for us to learn and share and talk about these things. So I hope those of you who are curious are listening now. On that note, I have our survey results here. The first question was, has your group taken action to address risks arising from the revised OECD guidelines on intangibles in DEMPE?
The first interesting observation from this question was that a little over half the people said they had taken action to address DEMPE-related risks. The sorts of action that they took differed. About equal numbers had changed pricing in response to certain DEMPE characteristics in their transactions, and an equal number had changed substance or moved people around in order to account for DEMPE substance. There was another group of people who had moved their intangibles between locations in order to account for DEMPE substance. We have a range of activities that companies had engaged in to account for this new guidance, and more than half the people had done something.
It's a critical enough concept that people are taking action. And what that action is depends, again, on the facts and circumstances. The next question we asked was, in your experience, which of these business changes has caused the biggest headache from a DEMPE perspective? Jack?
We had 4 choices here: the integration of new acquisitions, the dispersion of senior management, the development of new types of intangibles, and increased collaboration with third parties. We found that it was the integration of new acquisitions and the dispersion of senior management that were overwhelmingly causing headaches for the folks in our survey. And the 2 of those together accounted for more than 90% of the survey results. Those were split about 50-50 between those 2 groups. And this is not a huge surprise. Acquisitions always cause problems because you have your international operating structure that's fully aligned with your DEMPE, and you buy a company in a jurisdiction where you haven't had operations and they've got DEMPE substance there, and you have to figure out how to integrate that into your existing operating model. And that might require changes in governance, it may require transfers of IP, or it may require a complete overhaul. One that we're hearing quite a lot about has to do with dispersion of senior management. It's something that's been accelerated since the COVID pandemic has changed the way that everybody works and allows people to work remotely much more easily. The fact pattern looks something like, we've got all of this substance in our DEMPE hub in a tax-favored place, and then our head of technology leaves and we want the new one to be hired, and that person exists in a different country, and that person then hires a team under them in a totally different jurisdiction. Over time, you see the dispersion of this DEMPE substance into other jurisdictions. That's creating a lot of problems for taxpayers.
DEMPE is tied to intangibles inherently. The reason it came about was in response to high-value intangible property being unclear where it was tethered. There were many during the BEPS project that thought where senior management and decision makers sit should matter and should be tied to these high-valuable intangibles.
Because the framework is subject to interpretation, what's happened over time is that DEMPE has become the shorthand way of referring to these high-level functions, whether or not they are directly associated with the development of intangible property. And it's a shorthand way of saying we have sufficient high-level functions to warrant having non-routine income associated with our jurisdiction. And as a practical matter, DEMPE, as it was originally formulated, it didn't require that you had to allocate profit according to people functions. It simply said that you had to have sufficient people functions to support the transfer pricing. That could be a very small number of key functional performers that are performing these high-level functions in conjunction with a transfer pricing model that appropriately reflects the risk that they're taking on and the value that they're adding. In many instances, what you find is tax authorities saying, that's really hard to figure out. So I'm going to look around and see wherever I have these high-level people, and I'm going to allocate profit to those high-level functions. That's a bit of a perversion of what the original intent was, but that is the way that it's developed in some instances.
There is definitely a tension between whether you view DEMPE as a threshold question, which a lot of people interpret the OECD guidelines to mean, versus is it really a question about how you price transactions by looking at where the DEMPE functions are located. That is a tension that plays out repeatedly in the controversy space, also in how tax authorities are viewing DEMPE versus some taxpayers.
That connects to the next polling question, which is what tools and techniques do you use to identify DEMPE risks? The top one is analysis of headcount data, probably because it's easy to measure, right?
I would say this is the area where companies are undertaking the maximum amount of work. It's also really challenging because it's not entirely clear from the guidance what exactly is the DEMPE function. The approaches that companies have taken, and these are the responses we have. We had analysis of headcount data, which over a third of the respondents selected. There's real-time gathering on decision-making, also approximately a third. Detailed process mapping and RACI analyses, RACI standing for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, and country-by-country reporting data and transaction-level functions. There are various different ways in which companies are gathering information on their DEMPE activities and trying to support that. There's still a fair amount of uncertainty. When you say there's analysis of headcount data, what do you mean by that? Are you looking at senior management? And if so, what do we mean by senior management? At what level do you stop calling somebody senior? What types of senior management? If you're looking at DEMPE, is it just R&D? Are you looking at other types of activities? So there is still a lot of uncertainty as to what exactly you mean by DEMPE functions, but there are all these different ways in which companies are trying to identify them and support their pricing based upon the DEMPE risks and the DEMPE activities that they've identified.
The next question we have was, have you experienced a transfer pricing audit where a tax authority asserted DEMPE functions were under-rewarded?
We got about a third of the respondents saying, yes, they had an audit where the tax authority asserted that DEMPE functions were under-rewarded. Some of the respondents, the audit is still ongoing. There were about an equal number that said the audit was resolved without an adjustment and that the audit was resolved with an adjustment. I should also note in the respondents who answered no, that the DEMPE concept, in principle, the guidance applies to the development, enhancement, etc., of intangibles. And also, if you actually combine it with the control over risk framework that the OECD also came up with around the same time as the DEMPE guidance, in practice, we see tax authorities applying it much more broadly, even outside the traditional intangible development context. It is possible that there are other sorts of audits where it wasn't explicitly a DEMPE assertion by the tax authority, which still leverage some of those concepts in making adjustments.
In the US, we do see audits that are incorporating DEMPE principles without naming them as such. The US never formally adopted DEMPE into its transfer pricing regulations, but has maintained that the existing 42 regulations are fully consistent with the DEMPE framework. They do apply DEMPE concepts in their exams, but they don't necessarily call it DEMPE.
The last question that we asked, thinking to the future and thinking about controversy, what dispute prevention approaches has your group used to manage risks related to DEMPE challenges?
The vast majority of our respondents said that they are adopting an enhanced defense file and audit readiness approach to DEMPE. Most companies are making sure that their transfer pricing documentation is ready for a DEMPE challenge. And then a much smaller subset, just shy of 20%, said that they were considering APA, which stands for Advanced Pricing Agreement, as a way to manage potential DEMPE challenges. And about 4% said that they are in the ICAP program, which stands for International Compliance Assurance Program, as a way of preventing challenge to their DEMPE substance. What will be very interesting is to keep an eye on the various transfer pricing litigation. If a taxpayer loses a big case based on DEMPE substance, we may see a shift in how companies are managing this and responding to it.
Thank you both. Any closing thoughts on this topic?
It was fascinating for us to get to hear and respond to the results of the survey. The takeaways with respect to DEMPE revolve around three key things to keep in mind for taxpayers. The first is make sure you have your story down with respect to what your DEMPE is. What are the value drivers in your business? How do you define your intangible property? Who's the owner of that intangible property? And making sure that feeds into your master file and your local transfer pricing documentation. Secondly, making sure you have your governance structure down. It really does matter who is making the key decisions, and that's both with respect to DEMPE and with respect to the management and control of risk. Having clear governance structure that delineates those roles and responsibilities and is in line with the way that the business is actually operating is really important. And third, you got to give some thought to how you want to engage with tax authorities. Making sure that you've given that some thought is going to be key to success with engaging with them.
The DEMPE landscape isn't static. Almost 10 years after the guidance, we're still seeing changes. And so I think it's important for companies to keep that in mind as you are trying to figure out DEMPE risks and trying to figure out what the appropriate policy around intangibles and pricing is. Not to just think about where things stand currently, but also to think about where the evolution is headed. Would policies and pricing hold up given the evolution, let's say in 5 years or so? It's hard to have a crystal ball and say, where do you think different tax authorities are going to be in 5 years? But just looking at the trend, the greater focus, the more emphasis on having substance, etc., factoring that in as companies think about their policies for the future and not just taking this as a static framework.
Thank you both, Jack and Preeta, for joining me. This was really enlightening, and we'll continue to keep an eye on this and see how the DEMPE putty gets played with as we go forward.
It was my pleasure, Brittany.
Thank you, Brittany.
Thanks for joining me on this adventure in transfer pricing. See you next time.